Starting off with a hind quarter of beef, it's from a side weighing 152 kilos and it classified out at an R4L. We now need to break it down into its main primals. The flank will be removed, the thin flank or the fleshy end. It's going to be removed, but we need to follow the seam under the cod fat and under the skirt muscles. So at this point we're not cutting into any flesh, it's just following that natural seam between the fat and the muscle. We follow this down to the point of the tip of the hip bone. Once we've reached the tip of the hip bone, we now need to mark the face of the eye muscle to give us a measurement for cutting the sirloin from the flank. So we'll use the eye measurement from the tip of the eye, and we're using half of that eye muscle size to make a mark, which will then be joined up to the tip of the hip bone. Now we need to bring the two marks together with a cut line and saw through. Finally finishing off to separate the thin flank from the hind quarter. To remove the fillet, we just need to clear away some of the channel fat to actually show us the line of the fillet. We need to free it from the actual hip bone so we can remove or release the head of the fillet. Having released the head of the fillet, we now need to release from around the backbone, just clearing away excess fat and gristle first, and then we can work around the contour of the backbone. Following down the bones, making sure not to go into the muscle between the bones. The fillet now can be removed intact away from the sirloin. To remove the sirloin, we're going to use the first lumbar vertebrae as our mark, and we're going to saw through the centre of that bone. And finish off with the knife right the way through. Bearing in mind that after every sawing motion we remove any visible sawdust. To remove the rump or Pope's eye, we're using the pubic cavity as our guide. And we're going to cut on a mark approximately 1/3 from the tip of the pubic bone. Again, making sure we only cut through the bone and not deep into the flesh. Now we follow through with the knife and remove the rump or Pope eye primal. To break the top bit down, from the top side, the silver side, and the thick flank or fleshy end, and the leg or hock, we'll remove the hock, finding a point just below the kneecap. Into the joint, and then cutting down at an angle Before we can remove the top side, we need to remove the H-bone. So first we remove the pad of meat that lies on the inside of the bone. This pad of meat can be trimmed up and used with the rest of the trim for mince or further manufacturing. Working around to free the meat in the whole of the hip. Now working around the back of the bone. Now we need to free the joint of the ball and socket. At this stage, if you need a little bit more leverage, the steel is a useful tool to help pull the bone away from the meat, allowing you to see behind the bone. Our hip bone. To remove the top side muscle, we're going to follow down the seam. So we need to just remove some of the overlying fat, which then will allow us to find that seam. With the point of the knife, just taking care not to cut into any of the muscle. Following down that seam onto the main leg bone or femur. Once you get to the leg bone, work over and across the back of it, still following that natural seam. And as we pull the top side muscle apart, it's actually showing us the seam that we're following. We're following that carefully, not to cut into any of the underlying muscle. At this point we're following the seam between the top side and the silver side. And when we get to the external fat, we just cut right the way through, which removes the top side muscle in one primal piece. Before separating the silver side from the thick flank or fleshy end, we need to remove the main leg bone. Just using the point of the boning knife so as not to cut too deep into any of the underlying muscles. You must also remember to take out the last little bone, the kneecap. To separate the two primal pieces now, we follow through the natural seam This seam takes us down the silver wall of the side of the silver side. And once down over that silver wall, we cut straight through the fat. That separates our silver side and our thick flank or fleshy end.